Hello, everyone. It's Patrick Hill from Triple Point. We're going to get ready to start the webinar. Just going to give people just one more minute to see if they can get into the webinar. Okay, we'll get started. I was going to share my video, but apparently my webcam is not cooperating with me right now and refusing to focus. Thank you for coming to this webinar today. We're going to talk about cracking the algae code, a roadmap to lagoon compliance. So for those who don't know me, I'm one of the founders here at Triple Point. I was employee number one 14 years ago or so, from when we started the company. That's me out on a boat on a lagoon, and this playback doesn't work too well. But I was measuring sludge on this occasion. So part of my role here at Triple Point is these kinds of educational things, and then it's also research and development. And so I'm really excited to share with you some of our findings and just to help educate you on this lagoon algae, because it is definitely a big issue. So we're going to talk about why algae causes violations. We're going to talk about some of the academic literature around algae. We're going to talk about common algae mitigation strategies, and then look at a case study of what we've done recently to study algae and how we can potentially help reduce it. So Triple Point, we're a company that's really focused on helping lagoons do it better. We believe lagoons are the easiest and easiest system to operate, the lowest cost system, and there are a lot of them out there that simply, maybe need to be upgraded in order to meet either stricter compliance requirements or help to improve energy efficiency, or to expand capacity, or whatever the case may be. We're really, really focused on lagoon systems and being the expert in lagoon systems. And so over the years, we've developed a number of different technologies. Our Aeries lagoon aerator, obviously good for replacing surface aerators and or old aeration systems. Our nitrox ammonia removal system is specifically designed to help reduce ammonia in cold weather applications, and really any application, but certainly the cold weather ones are most challenging, help you meet that really, really low ammonia limit. And then also our nitrox plus D system, which is designed for the total nitrogen aspect or total inorganic nitrogen aspect, depending on where you are. So those are things that may be coming down the pipe for a lot of lagoon systems in the future, is to meet total nitrogen requirements. So we've really worked hard to develop a series of solutions that can help you meet any compliance requirement, and so that's us in a nutshell. So we really feel like kind of what makes us different is that we focus on lagoons, and that's all we do. So that's number one, right? We're just singularly focused on helping lagoons do it better. This is why we offer these webinars, for example. I mean, I'm not trying to make this a sales pitch. I'm trying to make this education. I'm an expert. I want to share expertise, and I want to help you to manage your lagoon better, right? And so I often look at, when you're looking to get an upgrade on your lagoon system, you're really giving your lagoon system an open heart surgery, And I often say in this respect, like, if you personally were going to get open heart surgery, would you go to a general practitioner, somebody who does everything, or would you go to a specialist, somebody who focuses in on that one thing? No, you'd obviously go to the specialist, right? And so I think if you have a lagoon upgrade, I mean, working with us, we hope we could do the best job for you, given our focus and our expertise. The other thing we do is we really try to tailor our solutions to your lagoon system. We really don't believe in a one-size-fits-all approach. We feel like everybody's got different objectives, everybody's got different needs. And we're going to do our best to give you the most inexpensive, easy to operate, and functional system that you can get. And then finally, we stand behind everything that we do. We call it, we say it, we do it guarantee. Like if it's not working or if there's something wrong with the system that we provide you, like we're gonna go out there and fix it. Like we're not in the business of having dissatisfied customers, and so we really try to have that follow through component as a company that really cares. At this point, we have over 200 installations nationwide in Canada. And we've really worked hard to build our installation base and our expertise over the last 14 years. And thank you to everybody who's put their faith in us. If you're on the line, anybody has a trip point system, we really appreciate it. And it really has given us a lot of experience and helped us to execute better and learn every single time. If you like this webinar, you like webinars in general, you need CEUs or PDH credits, please check out our Lagoon University platform. It's completely free. You can go on there. There's I think 10 or 15, maybe even 20 modules at this point that you can watch, some of which we've got approved for CEU credit if you're an operator. And certainly all the PDH credits are there as well. You can get a good hour of education, learn more about lagoons. Really encourage you to take a look at this because it's a great resource. A couple last housekeeping things and then I'll jump in. We got a webinar coming up November 30th, another one talking about lagoon aeration efficiency. This is my co-founder, Brady O'Leary, is going to be doing this one. Brady's an excellent speaker, and everybody, he's always gotten really great ratings, so I think you should be really excited about attending that if you're at all interested. And then we're also doing another webinar in December on industrial lagoon aeration, or industrial wastewater treatment, lagoon wastewater treatment. So if you're interested in that, Ben Shackman, also extremely good presenter, very highly rated in all the surveys that we do after these things. And so I really encourage you to register for that one as well, if you're interested. So algae. Algae is a plant, first and foremost, right? It feeds on sunlight, right? It photosynthesizes. It's present in every lagoon system everywhere, pretty much. I don't think I've seen a lagoon. I don't care if it's complete mixed, if it's a complete mixed activated sludge system, it's just not, it's everywhere, right? It's always there. And it can be a huge problem. And I'll talk about what problems it can cause from a compliance standpoint in detail in this presentation. There's generally two different types. There's the green algae, it's most common you see. There's hundreds of specific species of it. It makes your water look the pea green color. And then there's the blue-green algae. And this is generally found in more acute situations. And this blue-green algae or cyanobacteria is very toxic. If, Lake Erie, they'll shut down Lake Erie if there's too much blue-green algae in the water and people can't go on the water because it is potentially dangerous to human health. Generally speaking, this is what it makes your water look like. It makes your water look this pea green color, and it's extremely difficult to deal with because the algae is just suspended in the water. It's very, very small. You can't physically remove it very easily. So why is algae the cause of permit violations? So there's some good academic literature on this. One, I'll cite a few examples. This isn't just me saying this. This is proven fact. So Dr. Linville Rich from Clemson University did a lot of great research on lagoons, and really I've learned a lot from him, and a lot of our stuff is really his stuff at the end of the day. I'm not trying to take credit for something that's not mine, but he basically said, the second myth of effluent BOD or CBOD in a lagoon is that the residual BOD is that there is residual BOD from the influent, when in fact most of the BOD is a result of algae that grows in the lagoon, right? So this is what his research found. We're not talking about when you get that BOD5 test, right, from your effluent sample. A lot of that is algae. It's not the residual of the BOD that came in. It's not the human waste or the industrial waste that's coming in. It's actually the algae that's growing into the lagoon later, right? And before I go on, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my, since he did go to, he was a professor at Clemson University. If I didn't mention my my beautiful Fighting Irish victory on Saturday. If you at all interested in college football and you want to watch a clinic on how to beat the number 4 team in the country, watch that game. We haven't had a great season, but it was amazing, and obviously I'm very excited about that. Apologize if you're a Clemson fan. 2 other studies that I was researching, and there's more. I'm just going to point these out. One study, 24 Colorado municipal lagoon systems, and found that 2/3 of the effluent violations were due to algae. And then another one found that 1 ton of dry weight of algae can be produced for every 1 million gallons of domestic wastewater coming in. And so clearly algae is driving issues with BOD and TSS, and I'll explain how and why that's the case here as we move along. So algae can cause, like I said, BOD, TSS violations. It can cause pH violations. If you got really high pH and you're wondering why, chances are it's algae. Total phosphorus and dissolved oxygen violations as well. If you have any of these limits on your permit, obviously BOD and TSS is pretty standard. And this graph here on the right shows, this is from our case study, and I'll dive into our case study a little bit more, but we basically measured chlorophyll side by side with taking BOD and TSS samples to the lab. And you can see there's a very, very good positive correlation between the chlorophyll readings and the BOD and TSS. If the chlorophyll goes up, the BOD and TSS goes up, right? So this is just further proof that algae is largely the cause of probably most of your effluent permit violations, or most of your BOD and TSS that's in your effluent water. So why? Well, to understand why, there's several reasons that I'll get into. But let's start with, let's say, BOD, for example. So the way algae works is it's obviously during the daytime when it has sunlight, it's consuming, right, carbon dioxide because it's a plant, right? And it's giving out oxygen, right? And then at nighttime, it moves into a respiratory mode where it actually consumes oxygen and puts out carbon dioxide, right? And the reason this is a problem is when you take your BOD sample, right, and you take it in the bottle and you look at the bottle and it looks green, kind of like the bottle I showed you earlier, right? And you take it to the lab. What the lab does is they take that bottle, they put a cap on it, right? And they're measuring the dissolved oxygen in that bottle, right? Or the dissolved oxygen over a period of time. And they're measuring it over 5 days. So they start with the baseline of day 1, before the study starts. They measure over 5 days, depending on the oxygen depletion, right? They're determining BOD, right? In effect, in a roundabout fashion, that's exactly what they're doing, right? And so when you take that bottle and you put it into a dark BOD incubator, the algae in that bottle starts to respire, which means it starts to take oxygen out of the water and replace it with carbon dioxide, which it makes it look like you've got BOD when really all you got is algae in your BOD test bottle. That's why algae drives up your BOD. So if you think about this cycle through the day, it's really interesting, right? And it's really interesting on a number of levels because it means that you will have different levels of BOD, TSS, and pH depending on what time of day you pull your sample. So, and I'll get into this a little bit more detail on the TSS and on the pH side of things here in a minute. But this study we found was from Brazil, and they looked at and they measured chlorophyll, which is an indicator of algae in the water, and they measured it at different depths and at different times of day. And this is the data that they came up with here. And what we did is we then translated that into TSS based on a chlorophyll to TSS ratio that we were able to determine. And so you can get wildly different results depending on the depth in which you take that sample and the time of day you take that sample. Generally speaking, the best time of day if you have to pull a grab sample is either the first thing in the morning or the last thing in the afternoon, generally speaking. And you're trying to avoid the solar apex, right? You're trying to avoid that noon time. right? When the sun is at the top of the sky, when you're photosynthesizing as much as possible, right? Now, I say this with the caveat of you need to consult your permit. Everybody's permit is different, right? And if you look at your permit, you know, and you have questions or you're unsure as to what you're allowed and not, you are and are not allowed to do, please talk to your regulator. But let's say, to give you a point, let's say you had a lagoon, right, that had a 1 grab sample required per 30 days, per month, right? And basically they're saying it's an average, but really it's an average of 1, right? And you could take multiple samples, right? And so if it's a grab sample, you get to choose when you pull the sample, how you pull the sample, how deep in the, you know, that effluent structure you pull that sample, for example, the frequency of it. You can pull it once, you can pull it 3 times, you can pull it 5 times, you can pull it 30 times in 30 days. Like, it's an average. So you can pull it as many times as you want. And so it's a smart move to pull it at the right time of day, right? If you get to choose, right? So just like taking a test. And again, if it is allowed by your permit, and you need to look at your permit and talk to your regulator about that. Little pro tip there for you. So TSS. TSS is made up of a number of different things, right? It's a physical, it's total suspended solid. So it's a physical, it's things we can see, or at least see under a microscope to some degree, right? And it can be made up of algae cells, bacteria, protozoa, higher life forms, right? And then just the inorganics that are in the water, right? The silt, the clay, the sand, whatever's in there that might find its way into your test bottle, right? Usually, like we discussed previously, 90% or 80% of that TSS is algae. And how do I know that? How do I know that? And of course, it's different site to site, and you know, your site might be totally different for some peculiar reason, but I'm talking about in generalities and in general in my experience. The reason I know that is because I see it all the time, and you can see it too. So next time, if you're interested to see what's in your what physically those solids are that are coming out of your lagoon system, call your lab and say, hey, when you filter out the TSS, what they do is they force the water through a very, very, very fine micron, a 0.4 to 1.2 micron filter, right? They force it through there. So the solids stay on the one side and the water goes through the other side. So you should just ask them, say, hey, before you put that in the cooker, where they're gonna cook off all that water and then they're gonna weigh it later, send me a picture of it, right? And so here's a site where I asked for that. The effluent is the top one, right? Looks brown, gray, no algae in there, right? Of course there's no algae in there, it's the effluent, right? It just came out of a pipe. The bottom one is the lagoon effluent. What's all that green stuff in there? Well, of course it's algae, right? That's how algae affects your TSS. So pH, and I mentioned and alluded to this earlier. So pH, right, will be affected by algae because as the algae consume carbon dioxide, right, during the day, the pH will go up. And as they respire at night and do the reverse, the pH will go down. So your pH can vary, and this graph here shows you how much it can vary throughout the 24-hour period, right? And so most of the time when I see pH violations, I mean, I can't remember too many times, unless it's an industrial site or you have an industrial user discharging to your system, right? 9 times out of 10, high pH is because of algae. 9 times out of 10, and I've been doing this for 14 years. And so again, the way around this and the way to optimize your result for this, if you're able to pull grab samples, is to avoid pulling your grab sample around noon to try and pull it some other time of the day, preferably when the algae is still respiring, right? Finally, the way algae can affect your effluent samples is algae will actually sequester nutrients. So as it grows, right, it is taking up phosphorus and it's taking up nitrogen and it's building that into its cell wall, right? And algae will squirt its way through any kind of filtration that you might have. If you have like a cloth disc filter, as I'm showing here, it'll squirt its way through, and I'll show you how it does that here in a minute. it'll squirt its way through that 10 micron, 5 micron, 20 micron filter media, or if it's a sand filter, anything, it'll just squeeze. It's malleable. It's like a squishy ball, right? Or if you're just simply trying to precipitate phosphorus within the lagoon, right, it won't, the algae can prevent the chemical from binding to the phosphorus that's in the algae cell wall, right? And so it really has big impacts on what kind of total phosphorus you can meet. In fact, it's probably the #1 determinant factor as to what total phosphorus you can meet. Like if you got a lot of algae, you're going to be limited on what you can achieve without killing that algae first, right? So it does have a big impact there as well. So as a recap, what does algae need to grow? Well, it needs carbon dioxide like any plant, right? And it gets that from the aerobic digestion of Pvod within your system. So as you're aerobically digesting Pvod, as your lagoon is supposed to do, it's releasing carbon dioxide into the water, right? It's a byproduct. The algae is then consuming that carbon dioxide in its growth. It needs nutrients, which are present within your influent stream and present within your sludge on the bottom of your lagoon. It needs sunlight, which lagoons are great at because they are big bodies of water and have lots of surface area. It needs warm temperature, doesn't like growing in the cold, which again, because of the large surface area, the lagoon is de facto a heat exchanger, right, for temperature. And it warms up in the summer, it gets super cold in the winter, and so that's another factor. It needs quiescent water. It doesn't like to grow in agitated water, and it needs low turbidity, right? And I'll explain that in a minute. And most of these you can kind of do something about. You know, the nutrients, you know, you got the nutrients coming in, you can try and treat them in the lagoon, but it's a little bit tricky to treat nutrients in a lagoon. But most of these you can do something about. So we'll talk about that. So to go over the algae growth cycle, and this is straight out of my Notre Dame microecology textbook, okay? So it's not perfectly related to lagoons, it's more related to ponds and lakes, but it's the same principles apply. You have a nutrient load coming in, right? That coming into the lagoon, it's coming from the collection system, right? A lot of those solids will come in and they will start to settle down on the bottom potentially, right? A lot of the nutrients that are sequestered within those solids, unless you have a complete mixed lagoon, but it's really hard to completely mix a lagoon, if that makes sense. Even if you got a lot of aeration, you still have some settling in certain areas. Then the sunlight will penetrate the water column, right? And it will penetrate to the bottom where the nutrients are, and the algae will form on the bottom and then rise up to the surface and bloom. That's what we call a bloom, right? And it can create a serious amount of oxygen depletion within the water. It adds oxygen to the top layers of the water, but it depletes oxygen in the bottom layers of the water, unless you have decent mixing, right? Which creates anaerobic digestion of sludge, which can create odors, and which can really be problematic later on down the road, right? And so you can, if you don't, you know, algae can really kill your ecosystem over time. And primarily the way this is done is in lagoon systems, sludge starts to build up on the bottom. And sludge does two things, right? First of all, sludge is a nutrient sink, right? It's a cornucopia of nutrients sitting on the bottom of your lagoon. Secondly, the sludge reduces your depth, right? It takes up volume, it reduces depth. So as you build sludge up over a 20-year life cycle of the lagoon system, right? You're increasing the amount of nutrients that are in your lagoon and you're reducing the depth. So you're improving the environment for which algae to grow as time progresses, right? And so the first thing to realize about treating algae is that the root cause of algae growth is the sludge. That is the #1 reason you have a lot of algae. #1, absolutely. I mean, you're always going to have some algae, but if you got a lot of algae, that's the #1 reason for it. So if you're thinking about how to manage algae, you have to pay attention to the sludge. Now, there are obvious solutions to this, and I'll talk about a few of them. One is to remove the sludge. And we all love that idea, except we don't love the cost of that idea, right? But if you're going to do it, every lagoon needs to have sludge removal once every 20 to 30 years. It's just part of the way lagoons manage biosolids, right? It's part of the process. And so if you're at that point and you got really bad algae blooms, right, you need to think about dealing with the sludge one way or another. And you can do dry dredging or wet dredging. I recommend dry dredging, that top picture. I like it better because you can actually see physically the sludge has been removed from the system versus wet dredging. It's all underwater, you can't see it, and it can be an issue. Another way you can deal with it is you can look at bioaugmentation. And we have studied this over the years. I've seen people study this over the years. Basically, where you're adding bugs to the lagoon to help reduce the solids. They basically help to consume the volatile organics within the sludge, and in the process consume some of the nutrients in the sludge. This is generally a good idea. It's certainly a good idea if you're going to pay somebody to remove sludge. You can see how much sludge you can get out by adding these bugs. They are not necessarily cheap. They can be expensive. There are a lot of different manufacturers of these bugs, and I have to say, in my experience, and this is 14 years, and I've talked to a lot of manufacturers of these bugs, not all of them have a very high level of expertise about what they're actually doing and what their bugs actually do and how the bugs work, and you have to worry about the level of product quality they have, right? In certain instances, so be careful, but it certainly can work. The other thing is aeration. So this is our aerator. To give you an example, we have it's a portable aeration unit that has fine bubble aeration with a coarse bubble mixer in the middle. So it has the mixing and oxygen standpoint. And so we've actually done studies on this where we put this in. This is one study I'll show you. We put this in a lagoon, segregated off an area. Obviously, this customer had a lot of, this is actually an industrial lagoon. They had a lot of surface aerators. It was a 15-foot deep lagoon. And the surface aerators were simply just not mixing to the bottom, right? Because they're sitting at the surface. So they're going to have a hard time mixing to the bottom, where our aerator sits on the bottom. And so it's mixing from the bottom to the top. And so we added the baffle curtain and did set up these test areas, and we're able to measure the before and after sludge reduction within these test zones, right? And what we were able to see is that we were able to decrease the sludge volume by 44%, increase the water volume by 72.4%, and ultimately save them a bunch of money. Now, what I will say about aeration is that it's not a solution. If you don't have an aerated lagoon, dropping aerators in a lagoon to reduce sludge may be not the best solution to the problem unless you need them for some other reason. Like unless you're not getting Pvod removal, then maybe you add aeration because that'll help with that. Or if you're getting a lot of odors, then sure, add aeration because it'll help with that. But if you have, the best case scenario with this is if you have existing surface aerators that are perhaps old and are causing you maintenance issues, right? And you want to look at a more efficient system, a diffused aeration system like our Aries unit will save about 60% of energy. It will reduce the sludge blanket, and I haven't gotten to this yet, it will help to reduce some of the algae growth as well. So if you're looking for that kind of thing, this is a great additional reason to replace your aeration system ultimately. We are going to study at some point here on the docket is to look at adding bioaugmentation and actually injecting it into the center of our aerator, which we're calling our Aries injector unit, and seeing how that impacts, if that improves the sludge reduction with the aerator plus the bioaugmentation. So I may be presenting on that at some point. So another method that's commonly brought up and important to investigate is aeration. So what aeration does is it works in a number of ways to help mitigate algae growth. It strips the carbon dioxide out of the water, right? So it'll help create the carbon dioxide by breaking down the Pvod, the carbonaceous Pvod, and converting that into carbon dioxide. But then it also, the oxygen will strip it out of the water as it rises to the water column. So there's less carbon dioxide in the water, right, for the algae to consume and use in its photosynthesis. It creates foam, and it can create foam, it can create bubbles, it creates turbidity, right? It creates turbidity in two ways. Number one, it creates turbidity with just the bubbles that disrupt the sunlight's ability to penetrate to the bottom. And number two, it creates turbidity by suspending solids that stop the sunlight from penetrating to the bottom. So you're trying to disrupt the growth cycle. And then it has a cooling effect on the water because it's de-stratifying the water all the time. So it's keeping the lagoon a little bit cooler, which makes it a little bit harder for algae to grow. And that's why you generally see, it's one of the reasons you generally see that aerated lagoons have less algae than non-aerated lagoons. So Dr. Linville Rich, getting back to him, studied this. This isn't just me. I'm not making this up. This is scientifically proven. Where he looked at lagoons, a number of different lagoons, and the level of aeration in the lagoons. And these B1 to P1 were different lagoons and different levels of aeration across the lagoon. And so he used this data in order to create this graph, this beautiful graph. Everybody loves this. I love this graph. And it's measuring, it was looking at chlorophyll levels, right, as it relates to the amount of power, the amount of watts per meter squared, or is that cubed, of water that's in there, right? So obviously, as the more aeration you have, the less chlorophyll he was measuring, right? And that makes sense at the end of the day. And it lends to this concept that this actually works. So what does that mean? Well, I looked at a couple different scenarios on this, and I looked at, hey, if you needed 2 days of retention, right, and you had 600,000 gallons of water where it was equivalent to 2 days of retention time, then you need about 4 horsepower. And then if you, on the high end, if you need 5 days of retention and you have 300,000 gallons a day, that's 1.5 million gallons of water, right, which is about 10 horsepower, right? So it's not that much, actually, when you really look at it like that. And so, it's a tool, right? However, there are limitations to aeration, and I've been selling aeration for 14 years, okay? And we started the business, right, selling aeration for ponds, stormwater ponds, and lakes that had bad algae problems. And I can tell you from my own experience that it's not a slam dunk solution to algae, right? It's just not. Don't expect aeration to go in there and then just eliminate all your algae problems, right? It helps, but it's not a complete solution, right? Secondly, it won't kill the algae that's there. It just disrupts the algae from growing, right? So if you're gonna drop aeration in the middle of summer, it ain't gonna do anything for you, right? It'll help a little bit, but really it needs, a full cycle. It needs to go winter to spring, right? In order to have the best effect. Algae can grow anywhere in your lagoon system. It doesn't, unless you're going to aerate the entire lagoon system from start to finish, which you do need some areas for settling and polishing, typically to get the solids out of the water. It's going to grow somewhere, so you're not going to eliminate it. I don't recommend it as a singular solution to the problem. And the other thing is, again, on the O&M side, it's, if you have surface aerators and you want to replace them because they're old and inefficient and they're breaking down all the time and you're frustrated with them, diffused aeration is great. It's going to be more efficient, it's going to be less maintenance heavy, and it's going to help you control algae, right? But I wouldn't advise putting an aerator in to solve an algae problem if you're not planning on, if you don't have any aeration, don't need it, right? I don't think that's not really that's not the best use of that tool. So covers. Covers obviously are designed to restrict the sunlight from penetrating to the bottom where the algae forms, right? And so this is intuitively, we know this works, right? We can see that it's going to disrupt one of the fundamental things algae needs to grow. But we went, because we're a little OCD about these things, we went out and found a study, and we started looking at what's the scientific proof for this, right? So we found a study that was done in China, actually, where they took 3 different test plots within a really, really algae-prone water body. And in one, they did nothing. They just left it there, right? Test zone. The other test zone, they covered it, they shaded it, right? And then the last one, they shaded it and put aeration in it. And this is what they found, right? Versus the control. Typically, you could see about a 50% reduction in algae within about 5 days with just shading, right? And my philosophy on this is you don't need to have glacial water coming out of your lagoon system Algae is algae. Algae grows in the environment. It's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. If you get 50% reduction, that's probably good enough to meet whatever goals you have. Like you're probably going to be in permit. You're probably going to be doing good, in good shape. Then if you aerate and shade, you get about 60% reduction within 5 days, and you get 50% reduction within 2 to 3 days, right? So aeration helps to break the algae down faster, to cut it down. And our data also supports this, which I'll go into here in our case study. So lots of different types of covers out there. You got the bird balls, you got the hexes, you got the floating insulated covers. You know, they can be kind of expensive, you know. It all depends on depth, but if you're looking for 5 days of retention, right, you got to look at your average daily flow or your design average daily flow and times it by 5. That's how much volume you need. And then you got to figure out, based on your depth and your sidewall slope, how much square footage you need to cover that volume, right? And it can add up. I mean, I have not been super successful at convincing people to add covers because it can cost money like this. $4 to $5 a square foot is ballpark, and I haven't looked at this in a while. Now we have developed, well, we are now able to offer our own solution. We call it the Algae Protect. It's a cool hexagon, and you just throw it out there and it all nests together. It's very easy to install. It's no maintenance, doesn't blow away, and really does a great job. So if you're at all interested in this kind of solution, it does work extremely well, as I've proven in the scientific studies. So the final one I want to look, well, I got 4 others I'll quickly run through here. One is to filtration. Filters are easy. They're designed to basically force the water through a media. The media helps to keep the algae particle on one side, the water on the other. We have implemented filters. I'll show you some data here in a minute. This has limited effectiveness on algae. Algae are able to squeeze through the micron of the filter. They're like a squishy ball. They morph themselves and squeeze themselves through the pores. And so we are able to see a typical about a 50% removal through a filter for Pvod and TSS, and this translates to chlorophyll as well. And so it is effective and can be maybe effective enough, but of course filters have are a mechanical piece of equipment that require maintenance and so on, which doesn't help with the simplicity of operation, but I thought I'd mention it. Chemicals are really big. Copper sulfate's a very common chemical that's used. It's very effective, proven to be effective. In my experience, it's only as effective as you applying it to the lagoon. You have to apply it correctly. It's like Roundup, right? You need to spray the chemical on the plant. If you spray the chemical on the plant dies. But if you try to take a shortcut, it doesn't work, right? And so ideally, you're in a boat and you're going around the whole lagoon and you're spraying the surface of the lagoon with the chemical, right? That's how you get this job done well, right? And the other problem with algicide is that it kills the algae. The algae sinks to the bottom, and those algae have, like I said, nutrients sequestered in their cell wall, right? And so if you're not using any bioaugmentation or aeration or anything else to try and break down those nutrients, you're just compounding the problem over time. You're building up more and more and more nutrients. At least if the algae flows out of your system, it's taking some of the nutrients with it. But if you kill it all the time, then the nutrients stay on the floor and you create an even worse nutrient sink. And then finally, it's expensive. Copper sulfate's expensive. This is one example here of a 7-acre pond. This is a polishing pond that we learned about, and it's not cheap. I mean, we don't sell this stuff, but just my experience. Ultrasonic is a popular solution. It's been around for a while. I don't have any direct experience with it. I've heard anecdotal stories. I think it can be effective, but I also think it has a limited track record within wastewater lagoons. Most of the applications of ultrasonic technology for the lagoon, well, for algae control, are in drinking water reservoirs or in lakes where the water is largely clean, not one where it has the perfect algae growing environment. So if you're going to do anything like this, I really encourage you to do it a try-by before you do it, if at all possible. And then finally, barley straw has been proven to be effective. My experience with it, it's only effective on certain types of algae. And then what happens is that those types stop growing, but then other types of algae start to grow, right? And I've had, with that being said, I'm not taking anything away from people that use barley straw, because I've heard of operators or talked to operators that swear by it, just absolutely swear by it, and say it just completely solves their problem. And then I've had operators that say that it doesn't work, didn't work for them. And I think it's one of those things you got to try and see where it goes. And so more information, I think we have a blog on barley straw if you're interested. We also have other algae webinars on our Lagoon University site if you're interested in learning more. All right, so case study. So we are interested in this algae issue because it's has such a big impact on the effluent water quality of lagoon systems. And after all, we're lagoon specialists, and this is what we do all day. So we contacted one of our sites that has our nitrox lagoon ammonia removal system that's followed by a filter. And we were like, hey, can we study this? And this site is particularly tricky because it's a very big facultative lagoon. It has lots of sludge, hasn't removed sludge in 30 years. It is very shallow at this point, only 3 foot of water in this thing. It's like the perfect worst case scenario for algae. Like, this is the quintessential worst case scenario, right? Really high hydraulic retention time, no aeration in the lagoons. And so we're like, hey, we really want to study this, right? We want to understand how we can help them manage their algae better in the lowest maintenance and least cost effective way, right? So we came up with a plan that was sort of multifaceted, and this is my philosophy on algae. Unless you're going to cover, right, even if you are going to cover it, my philosophy on it is you need a multifaceted approach to controlling algae. You can't just do one thing, you need to do 1 or 2 or 3 things, right, to be effective. So the first thing we did is we put an Aeries injector in, and the idea behind this is we're adding aeration, right, which helps in and of itself, and then we're also able to inject chemical in there if we need to, in order to control the algae directly. The second thing we recommended and did was put recirculation in. So we're recirculating the effluent water back to the primary. And the reason for this is we want to create this virtuous loop where the water is moving more. And we know if it moves more, right, algae tends to not want to grow in a moving water as opposed to stagnant water. And then finally, we wanted to see what were the impacts of adding algicide. Could we inject the algicide within our injector and within our aeration and really get effective treatment? So we set up 3 different pilot test locations. A is basically the settling lagoon, that final lagoon there, that the effluent to that lagoon. So that's all the water gets to that point, goes through the reactor, goes through the filter and into the discharge, right? So we wanted to set up a test spot there. We want to test this also pre-filter after the reactor. That's test location B. And then C is the ultimate effluent to the system, right? Obviously, we want to test what the effluent is. So we have measured up to this point BOD, SBOD, PBOD, TSS, pH, and chlorophyll, right? And we're measuring the chlorophyll using a total algae sensor provided by YSI, which is specifically designed for this task. So before I continue the results, you're probably like, what? PBOD, SBOD, what the heck is that? Well, these are variations on BOD. So BOD is made up of soluble BOD, right? So that's the BOD that's just dissolved into the water, right? And particulate BOD, right? That's the portion of suspended solids that is BOD, right? And so the math is fairly simple. You're basically taking, you test for BOD, right? Which is just everything, nothing done to it, right? Then you test for soluble BOD. And the way they test for soluble BOD is they run the BOD through a filter, right? So they remove the solids, right? And then they put that in the incubator and test that, right? So in large part, they're removing they're absolutely removing the algae in that instance, right? And what you get left with is soluble BOD, right? And so you take the soluble BOD and you take the BOD and you minus out the soluble BOD and you get your particulate BOD. Most of that particulate BOD in the effluent is algae, right? 80 to 90% of that particulate BOD is algae, right? So before I get into the data, we started this in late August, and we're going to continue studying this for some time. You know, there are some challenges in this, like we're starting in the middle of summer, so we're already in full bloom season here. So in that sense, I don't think we've gotten all the data we want or seen the effectiveness that we could have possibly seen at this point. We had one algae probe, and we were just moving it around between the locations, right? A, B, and C, just moving it around every 2 days or so. I mentioned the lagoon has lots of sludge in it, so this is really a worst case scenario. They have really low flow. As a matter of fact, they have such low flow in the summertime that they actually shut off one of their primaries. Because if they don't shut off one of their primaries, right, one of the two twin primaries, they don't get enough flow through the system because it evaporates, right? And they can't do that. They have to have flow going all the time. And so that really created a challenge, because when they started getting into fall, they didn't get enough rain, and then they had to open up that primary that had been sitting there all summer, right? With sludge. Talk about perfect algae growing conditions. I mean, it was just full of algae, and this shows up in the data, and I'll show that to you in a minute. So the polishing lagoon, this is where we expect to see the most algae. This graph here shows you the level of particulate BOD versus the level of soluble BOD in this water. And as you can see, mostly particulate BOD, and this is true across the entire system, right? And that is a huge indicator of algae, right? So again, our suspicions that they had a lot of algae are true. This shows you, again, the correlation between the chlorophyll and the algae. And as such, you know, you can see that as the chlorophyll goes up, the algae goes up. And this red line shows you where the water from when they had to open up that secondary primary that had been sitting all summer long, just being an algae growing machine, when that water started to hit the polishing pond. And you can see it was right at the beginning of October. You can see a marked difference between the chlorophyll BOD and TSS, right, at the end of October versus previously, right? And so that really shows how big algae has an effect on the actual BOD and TSS. So as we move through the system, it goes through the reactor, right? And the BOD came down, overall came down, right? Which is really interesting. The particulate BOD still makes up the vast majority of the BOD that came through the reactor. The reactor actually reduced soluble BOD, which is what we would have expected. But what was really interesting is that the reactor was reducing BOD and had, you know, very nominal impact on TSS, you know. And this is a complete, for those of you not as familiar with our nitrox system, this is a complete mix, aerated, covered reactor system. Only has about 8 hours of hydraulic retention time. So a lot less hydraulic retention time than 5 days or 3 days. And it still makes a pretty decent sizable impact on BOD reduction through the system. Chlorophyll was also reduced through the reactor. So this shows you the chlorophyll. So we're actually reducing algae through the reactor itself, which is awesome, right? And not something I expected, to be honest. I expected us to consume the soluble BOD, but I didn't expect the reactor to reduce the algae levels, right? And it did a relatively decent job of doing that. You can see that red line is below the blue line. So that was really, really cool. Then going from there through the filter into the effluent. And again, you look at the effluent, it's the numbers are pretty good, right? The overall, we're hitting our BOD limits here. However, most of that is particulate BOD, which just speaks to the fact that most of what's showing up as BOD within the test bottle is algae. It's not actually BOD from the effluent, right? We had good reduction of TSS and BOD. I showed you these graphs earlier through the filter system, and very little chlorophyll reduction through the filters, which I'll show you here, right? Just basically nominal chlorophyll reduction, which speaks to the fact that, again, filters in and of themselves aren't great at filtering out algae if the algae is alive. If the algae is dead, they can filter it, but if the algae is alive, they'll just squeeze their way through that filter, right? So interesting learning point. So overview. This shows you the 3 different locations for BOD and TSS. As you can see, the numbers trend down across the system, you know, with the exception that at the beginning of October, like I say, things got a little haywire because of that lagoon that was sitting there all summer long growing algae, just started just pummeling algae into the final polishing pond, right? So that really screwed the numbers, and it's really kind of unusual. Usually you don't see that with lagoon systems typically. But we were seeing an average of 47% reduction of chlorophyll across the whole entire system, right? Which I'll show you here, which is great. So we actually reduced algae through the reactor mainly, and then a little bit through the filter and then out. So again, it speaks to this kind of multi-barrier approach to algae, right? You got to go from here to here to here to here, right? And you got to reduce it a little bit along the way. And so really, really happy with that. So just as takeaways, this shows you Drew Hess. I can't mention Missouri without mentioning Drew Hess. He's our rep municipal equipment systems. If you're in Missouri, give him a shout. Guy's awesome here. Highly scientific test we did here on site. On the right is the algae filled water from the pond. On the left is the slightly less algae filled water from the effluent. And you can see just by looking at it that there's a color difference between the two. Which is what you would expect if we're actually reducing the level of chlorophyll through the system. But everything BOD, TSS, chlorophyll were reduced through the nitrox reactor and through the filter. Most of the algae reduction occurred in the nitrification reactor with only maybe 8 hours of HRT, hydraulic retention time, so really not as much as 3 days, and we're still seeing a decent reduction. Like I said, the multi-barrier approach to me is the best way to manage algae. Everybody wants a one quick fix, but it's really, you got to take a multi-barrier approach. Positive correlation between BOD and chlorophyll, kind of what we would have expected, but prove that in the study for sure. The water coming from from the upstream lagoon really had a big impact on the numbers, which again reinforces the data. So in the future, we want to study some more. So we want to look at different types of chemicals, and I don't really want to recommend to my customers they use chemicals all the time, but I want to recommend that they use them when they need them as a solution to algae. If they're really running up against their numbers, to go ahead, use it, and it will help, right? So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at ways to manage flow better during the dry period at this site. Can we avoid that scenario where we got all this pent up water in there and then we need to release it in order to keep enough flow going through the system? Maybe get multiple probes so we can have permanent probes in all 3 locations so we can test algae in real time across the continuum. And then testing different micron ratings of filter. Maybe if we went with, what's the effect of 10 micron? This was a 20 micron filter. Could we do 10? Could we do 5? How does that impact algae reduction across the system? So with that, here are my references. I open it up to questions. Yeah, thanks for being on the call today. If you want to put the questions in the chat, I can answer them there. And whatever I don't get to here, I'll try to answer after the webinar via email separately. PDHs and CUs are available upon request. So please email eve@lagoons.com or respond to the emails that we sent you for that, and she'll get those to you. Sometimes it takes a couple days, but she'll definitely get them to you. So with that, any questions? Okay. I haven't seen any questions come through. I'll give it a few more minutes here. We'll wrap. Somebody was asking about a rock filter for algae. So that's another common approach to Algae mitigation is putting the algae through a rock filter. These rock filters actually, I mean, there's these nitrifying rock filters, which you may or may not have heard of, that are completely submerged and have their own cells, and they're right after the lagoon. You go right into those from the effluent. But in the past, you know, they've had rock filters in the Midwest for a long time where it wasn't, you know, sometimes they just pile up rocks in the effluent corner of the lagoon, or pile up rocks somewhere in the lagoon. And my experience with them is most of the time I've seen those, they end up clogging over time. And they can be effective at reducing algae because basically you're, again, you're forcing the water to go through the rocks, and you're eliminating the light that can get to the water and grow algae. But you know, I haven't run across a rock filter that was designed, say, from the 70s to mitigate algae not having broken or clogged or need to be replaced or bypassed. I mean, it seems like every single one of them, it just has to get bypassed. And that's just my personal experience. Not to say that, you know, I don't, yeah, not that I'm trying to say that the nitrifying rock filters necessarily do that. There's a risk there for sure, but that's what I've seen with the ones that actually use it for algae mitigation that have been around for a while. Somebody was asking about nanobubbles. What happens with nanobubbles? So I don't have a lot of experience in nanobubbles. I think overall, as an aeration solution for a lagoon, you got to be careful with nanobubbles because they are so small that they're not going to mix very well, and you really need mixing in order to get really effective treatment in any wastewater system, but certainly within a lagoon system. And so, you know, I wouldn't use them as an aeration system per se in a lagoon, but I believe that they could probably be effective at mitigating algae growth by, you know, creating these clouds of bubbles that create that turbidity, right, that then prevent the sunlight from penetrating to the bottom. And so that's kind of what I imagine would be one of the ways you could do it. Having said that, nanobubbles, you know, it's a mechanical piece of equipment, you know, it requires O&M, and I'm always cautious. Even with our systems, I'm cautious, and we really pay attention to this with our systems too, of making sure that we provide equipment that's easily maintained and requires as little maintenance as possible, because lagoon operators have 10,000 things on their plate, right? They're the dog catcher, they're mowing the lawns, they're snow removal, they're doing all this stuff, they're reading the water meters, and they're running around with a chicken with their head cut off. And so I don't want to add more mechanical pieces of equipment to a lagoon system operator's plate if I don't have to. And I think nanobubbles could be a problem. I'm not saying they are, I don't know. Could be. I think that's what I'd be concerned about. Some people, what algae, somebody mentioned here about, you know, the effluent nitrogen or phosphorus being less than the effluent. So how is it possible that my effluent is higher than my influent? And there's a number of reasons for that. Algae could be part of that reason, because algae, again, sequesters the nutrients into its cell wall and can show up in those tests. And so if you have sludge that's a nutrient sink, and then you get an algae bloom and it's assimilating all of that nutrient into the algae cell wall, and then it flows out, then that's possible where it can actually cause that. Most often though, you're looking at a Benthal feedback scenario where the sludge blanket gets anaerobic, creates hydrogen sulfide. The hydrogen sulfide builds up underneath the sludge, right? And then lifts it to the surface because it's buoyant, right? It's a gas, it wants to go up. And that's where you see what we call nutrient rebound or Benthal feedback that occurs, where that's often why, if your influence less than your effluent in those cases. Okay, I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. I've just been informed by my esteemed colleague that you will receive a certificate of attendance within an hour of the webinar ending. Everyone will receive one, so you do not need to reach out. If you do not receive it, let us know, and we can respond to that email once you get it, and we'll sort you out. But yeah, I thank you for everything. I really appreciate you guys spending time. Please take the time to fill out the survey at the end of this. It's really helpful for us to see if like we're doing a good job or not. We really care about doing a good job on these webinars. We want to provide valuable content to you. And so your feedback is super, super important. We also have a competition here in the office for who's the best webinar presenter. And right now I have the highest rated webinar in history. So if you want to give me a 4, I would appreciate it. Because it would really give me some bragging rights around here. But please do fill out the survey as well. So thank you very much. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.